Last time we finished with the death of Mary the First and the ascension of Elizabeth the First. Now, you remember that Elizabeth was the daughter of the king, King Henry VIII, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who had been executed for apparently cheating on him. And now, and then Elizabeth had been in a precarious situation because uh, the king wanted to really kind of forget that he'd ever been married to Anne Boleyn and concentrate on his next children. So there were questions about whether Elizabeth was really a legitimate daughter or not. As far as the Roman Catholics were concerned, and I mean those Catholics who have an interest in what happened with Elizabeth, they thought that she was basically a bastard because they said that the divorce between her father and Catherine of Aragon had been a load of old fucking bollocks, and they said that the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn had been a load of fucking bollocks, and that therefore Elizabeth was a bastard and was illegitimate. Now, this was the opinion of the King of Spain and also of the Pope and of the French royal family and many, religious types, cardinals, bishops, etc., and of quite a lot of people in England as well. So her position on the throne was not guaranteed to be easy in any way, because she had a lot of enemies. She was a Protestant, and this meant that she could rely on the support of certain people, but it also meant that she had enemies elsewhere. If she had been a Catholic, then probably these Catholics who were pissed off with her would have been less pissed off with her, and wouldn't have made a big deal about the divorce stuff. Anyway, she was the last surviving child of King Henry VIII, and she was the only person really to be the legitimate Queen of England or ruler of England. So, what did she do when she came in power to try to take care of herself and put herself in a position of strength? Well, one thing she did was to be quite gracious to her enemies and to sort of say that she would allow people to be religious in whatever way they want. She was going to be a Protestant, but that didn't mean that everybody else had to be. And she said that she wouldn't try to make windows into men's souls. But she was a Protestant, and people were interested or worried to see what she would do with the Church of England, of which she was now the head. The question of killing Protestants and burning them, that was out of the question. She wasn't going to do that. But neither was she going to horribly persecute Catholics and burn them in a sort of act of revenge. Well, that was her plan anyway. And she found people to advise her. She thought it was important to have a group of people around to give her good advice and sort of help her to make the right decisions and to do things for her. In terms of marriage, she wasn't interested in getting married to anyone. That was really low on her list of priorities. Now, other people were saying, oh, you've got to get married, you've got to get married. And she said, no, fuck off. I don't want to get married, at least not yet. And she never did get married, spoiler alert, and became known as the Virgin Queen, not just because they thought she hadn't ever had a shag, but because she never got married, had a husband or any children. so we don't really know what to say about that. But she had this guy called Cecil, and she made him Lord Burleigh, and this Lord Burleigh was one of her chief advisors, and a guy that was a sort of a good pair of hands for her to rely on with the government and stuff. Um, so, like her father had done, she had these people around her that she relied on, sort of politician guys, and she'd made Cecil into a lord, you know, to rather than pick someone who's already a lord, you know. Now, I made a couple of mistakes in the last video. It was Jane Grey who was the Jane who they tried to put on the throne instead of Mary, and who had then been executed by Mary. It was Jane Grey, and her father-in-law wasn't Lord Studley, it was Lord Dudley, and he was the Duke of Northumberland, or had been. But they're all dead now, so it doesn't matter so much, but that's a correction from the last video. Now, Elizabeth had not wanted to necessarily get married, but she did have men who were interested in her, and some of them she liked, either as friends or as advisors or supporters or a bit of both, or as potential lovers. And we don't really know the ins and outs and personal details about her relationships with these various men. She may well have had a shag now and again, but we don't know, you know. Was she a virgin in the sense of never had sex, or was she just a virgin in the sense of never got married? We'll never know. So anyway, one of the guys that she liked and who liked her was this Lord Dudley, and this Lord Dudley is not the same Lord Dudley as the one from before, but is a son of his, and this Dudley is the Earl of Leicester, I think. Well, he's Lord Dudley anyway. Lord Dudley really fancies Elizabeth, and he thinks she's fucking brilliant, and she thinks he's awesome as well. And he tries to get her to marry him, and she keeps saying no, I'm not interested in that, and she's sort of playing games with him and stuff. And anyway, a lot of people don't like this Dudley because they're jealous of him because he's close to the Queen, and they think, what's he up to, you know? But there is evidence to suggest that the relationship between them was quite an honest one, and they did like each other, you know. And there was one point when they were going to get married, but they didn't. But Dudley was married to this woman already, you see, and he was married to this woman already, and she fell down the stairs and died in an accident. But some people said, well, maybe it wasn't an accident, maybe she was pushed down the stairs, you know, because it was quite convenient, because when she was dead, it freed up Dudley to marry Elizabeth, potentially, but Elizabeth didn't want to, and it didn't really work out. Anyway, Dudley was accused of murdering his wife, but they said he was innocent, so he either got away with it or hadn't done it. So anyway, there was this other cunt who wanted to marry her, who was this French duke, who was a brother to the King of France, and she fancied him. But because he was a Catholic, and because the English didn't really like the French very much, that never got off the ground. Yeah, and one of the things that happened towards near the end of Elizabeth's reign was something called the Saint Bartholomew's Massacre, which was in France, in Paris, when all the fucking Protestants were killed by the Catholics with the help of the French king and monarchy. And that really made the English not want her to marry a member of the French royal family, even though he wasn't really involved with that massacre personally. It was like, you know, we don't like the fucking French and we don't like Catholics and stuff. So this French guy was not able to marry the Queen. So that's two characters. Now, Philip of France, remember, had been married to Mary, and he had his eyes on Elizabeth as well, and had sort of spoken up in her defense when Mary was going to have her killed. And but he was disappointed because Elizabeth told him, sorry, but you know, thanks, but no thanks. Um, um, so Elizabeth is remaining and remains single, even though she's got a lot of people interested in her. And Ivan or Ivan of Russia, who was called Ivan the Terrible, was one candidate for her. And there was this king of Denmark, I think his name was Christian, he wanted it as well. There was some Austrian cunts as well. All those kinds of cunts were asking her to marry them, and she was telling them all to fuck off. So she was single, she had some advisors around her, she had all these people trying to suck up to her, and she had some kind of favourites, but she was very careful not to alienate anybody and to make the same mistakes as Richard II had made or Edward II had made. She was very careful to try not to fuck people over and piss people off too much. So yeah, and she had these guys that were really keen to suck up to her. Now, also during this time was the age of exploration, and Columbus had started this whole thing, and this guy Vasco da Gama of Portugal, and the Spanish and Portuguese, and also the Dutch had been traveling around the fucking world and discovering new lands and creating colonies. And the English had started it as well now, and there was this cunt called Sir Francis Drake, and he was a fucking sailor, and he was also a privateer. Now, privateers were basically pirates, but they were pirates that had permission to be pirates from the monarch of England. And the Queen, Elizabeth, didn't like the Spanish. The Spanish were big enemies of the Queen because they'd said she's a bastard, and they'd said, let's have her overthrown. They were encouraging people to assassinate Elizabeth, you know, with the Pope and other Catholics in Europe were trying to kill Elizabeth and have her done away with. And the Spanish were big rivals as well. And as the English discovered new lands and settled in lands in the Americas and overseas, they came into conflict with the Spanish because the Spanish had already established their empire overseas, and so they was fighting over land and gold and stuff. And what Elizabeth did is she got these guys, these sort of rough sort of pirate types, and she said, look, you can go and do piracy, which means you can go and rob ships and steal their stuff and steal their ships and throw their crew over into the sea and fuck them all over. But you've got to make sure you just do it to the Spanish and don't do it to the English. And if we go to war with the French, then you can fuck them over as well. But she said, no, you can go over and you can fuck over the Spanish as much as you like, and just give me some of the shit that you find, you know. And Francis Drake was one of these cunts that was going around and attacking the Spanish and being a pirate. And he had a cousin who was called Walter Raleigh, and he was doing the same thing. But as well as being pirates, they also travelled around the world, and they discovered and made settlements in places. And Walter Raleigh settled and made an English colony in North America, and they called it Virginia after Elizabeth being a virgin. And you know, Virginia now is one of the American states. So that was started in Elizabeth's reign. So Elizabeth also had a cousin whose name was Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, if we go back a little bit, remember that Henry VII had married his daughter to the King of Scotland, James IV, who had then been killed by the English in the battle. Well, he had a son called James V, and James V had married this woman called Marie de Guise, who was a French lady, and they had a daughter who was called Mary, and she had been married to the Prince of France, who then became King of France, but who died very young. So she'd grown up in France, and then she returned to Scotland to be their queen. Now, Scotland, at the same time as England had done, had gone through a Reformation and had established a Protestant church, and lots of people in Scotland had become Protestant. It wasn't exactly the same type of Protestant as the English, you know, because the English was Church of England, and the Scottish was called Presbyterian. Mary was a Catholic, and when she went home to Scotland to be their queen, she had some shit to deal with cunts who didn't like her because she was a Catholic. And she had a half brother who was a bastard brother, who thought he should be running things and was pissed off about her being on the throne, and he didn't like it, plus he was a Protestant. Anyway, there were all these cunts in Scotland that were sort of backstabbing Mary, Queen of Scots, and giving her shit. Anyway, the thing about Mary, Queen of Scots that matters to Elizabeth is that Mary, Queen of Scots is actually the heir to the throne of England now. She's the next in the line of succession, and she's a Catholic. So all these Protestant guys in England are really fucking scared of her being like a second Mary, you know, like the last one and all that. So, and also a lot of the these sort of terrorists and cunts in other countries and some in England and Catholic people want Elizabeth dead so they can have Mary as Queen of England and then have a Catholic monarch again, Catholicism back, and fuck the Protestants over. So it's all a bit weird. And it gets worse, and they keep trying to kill her, and there are all these various plots. And the Duke of Norfolk, the new Duke of Norfolk, is involved in a plot to kill her, and that gets stopped, and he gets killed, and all the fucking cunts that were trying to kill her get killed. And Elizabeth has this dude called Walsingham, who's like a fucking spy master, and he's the fucking guy that tortures people and has spies everywhere and finds out what's going on, and he stops all these plots and plans to assassinate Elizabeth. So she survives, you know, she doesn't get killed. And Mary, Queen of Scots, actually ends up being sort of overthrown in Scotland. They kind of gang up on her and they kick her out, and they take her son, because she had a son, they take him away from her, he's a baby. And he's given to like her brother and others to look after and raise as a Protestant. And Mary has to fucking run away from Scotland, and she goes to England, and Elizabeth just puts her in prison and keeps her in prison for 20 years. And while she's in this fucking prison, all these random cunts are trying to assassinate Elizabeth, and they kind of involve Mary in this, and they sort of send her a letter saying, what do you think about us assassinating Elizabeth and making you Queen of England? And she kind of says, yeah, I think it's a good idea. So Queen Elizabeth's spy masters sort of show her this evidence that Mary's been a bit of a fucking, you know, pain in the ass. So Elizabeth doesn't want to kill Mary, but she sort of thinks that she has to. So she agrees, and they cut Mary, Queen of Scots' head off. Yeah, and now the King of Spain is called Philip II. He's the same cunt that was married to Mary of England, Elizabeth's sister, and had the same cunt who Elizabeth didn't want to marry. Well, he's sort of especially pissed off about Elizabeth killing Mary, Queen of Scots, and he raises an army and gets a navy together, loads of ships, and he says he's gonna invade England and take over England and overthrow Elizabeth and take over England himself and be King of England. And Elizabeth gets all the sort of navy guys together, like Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake and all those cunts together, and says, right, go and fucking fight the Spanish, and the Spanish actually get all fucked up, and all their ships sink in the sea, and all their armies drown, and they're all fucked. and they call that the Spanish Armada. Now, there was also another thing that happened afterwards where the English tried to sort of get revenge and send a big army and navy against the Spanish, and that all got fucked up. But no cunt ever talks about that, you know. Anyway, so we've got Virginia, we've got Mary Queen of Scots dead, we've got Elizabeth not getting married, not having any children. We've got all these cunts asking her to marry them, and she says no. We've got these cunts in government that are helping her out, like Cecil, and and anyway, this guy comes along, and Elizabeth kind of fancies him, and he can't remember his fucking name now. Anyway, this cunt that she fancies, he's a young man, and now she's getting on a bit now. She's a bit older, and I think he's called shit. Anyway, this cunt fancies it, and he ends up getting killed. He tries to overthrow her, and she, you know, has to cut his head off. And now also during this time, there's some shit going down in Ireland. Now the English haven't really talked much about Ireland, but basically when the Normans came over and William the Conqueror and all that, the Normans started invading Ireland and taking over bits of Ireland and stuff. And you know, all the way through this whole history of the medieval times, the English have sort of been in Ireland, sort of fucking them over and stealing bits of Ireland off the Irish and telling them to fucking, you know, support the English and be subjects of the English, but they weren't given rights. They were just sort of being fucked on by the English. And the English was sort of going over to Ireland and saying, we're your bosses and we're your lords now. And now, during the Middle Ages, during the times when England was Catholic, yes, we were fucking them over, but they were still the same religion as us, at least. But when Henry changed the church, and then the church is changed in England, and people start being Protestant, the Irish don't like that. They don't go along with that, and they don't have a Reformation in Ireland. They say, fuck all this Protestant shit, we're still Catholic. And it makes them more like keen to rebel against the English. Anyway, there's this cunt called the Earl of Ulster, and Ulster is a part of the north of Ireland. And this Ulster dude doesn't like the English fucking, you know, taking over Ireland and shit. So he leads a rebellion against the English, and he says, well, fuck them, you know, and they're quite successful, and they fight a kind of guerrilla or, you know, warfare where they're sort of attacking the English by surprise and stuff, and the English keep having to send armies and stuff to go over there, and they keep getting fucking done over and beaten by these Irish rebels and stuff. So Elizabeth decides to get sort of serious about this, and she sort of sends people over there to enforce to go and fuck the Irish, and anyway they go and they defeat these Irish, and these Irish all have to fuck off, and it's called the Flight of the Earls, and all these sort of what were powerful Irish lords, they all get kicked out of Ireland, and they all have to fuck off, and especially in the north, in this Ulster area. And as sort of punishment and revenge against the Irish, Queen Elizabeth has all the Irish people kicked out of parts of Ireland. They're all told to fuck off. And the English send people from England to go over to that part of Ireland and live there instead, you know, and they're Protestants. And they're Protestants, and they come from England, and they're living in this north part of Ireland now, because the Irish people have been fucked off their land and told to fuck off. So the English ones are living there now, and they get better land and stuff, and, you know, all the best, and all the Irish have to live in shit. And that's extremely important for what happens later on through their history right up to the present day. And it's called the Plantation of Ireland. The plantation means that we're planting people and planting settlements there. It's not the same as the plantations in America when they grow shit. Anyway, so she's fucked over the Irish. Um, um, also, in culture, some things happen during Elizabeth's reign, and they call her reign the Golden Age because of all the exploration, the colonization, and also because of the literature and stuff. And there's a little bit of science as well, but I don't know much about that. There's a bit of science going on as well. And of course, all the Protestants are quite happy because she's a Protestant and stuff. And there's quite a lot of propaganda, people painting portraits of her, writing poems about her, saying that she's fucking brilliant and stuff like that. So she has kind of a cult of personality going on as queen. Now, William Shakespeare comes along sort of towards the end of her reign, and you know about Shakespeare, he's fucking brilliant, and he writes all these plays and sonnets and stuff, and obviously he's enormously important. And then there are other people as well, various poets and playwrights and stuff, and musicians and whatever, artists and stuff. Anyway, and anyway, so Elizabeth lives to be, quite old, and and has had a relatively successful reign. She survived on the throne, didn't get assassinated. England didn't get invaded. The Catholics didn't get back into control and start killing all the Protestants. But because the Catholics had been causing shit, she sort of started persecuting the Catholics, and the Catholics were not allowed to be Catholic, and priests were illegal. If someone was a priest, then they were going to get fucking killed. If you're a Catholic priest, then you've got to be fucking killed. And people who were really strong Catholics and wanted to be Catholic, they had secret hiding places in their houses where the priest would hide, and it's called a priest hole. It was called a priest hole. So, some cunts would find out that you're a Catholic, or that they thought you were a Catholic. They'd come round knocking on the door, and I'd go, "Where's your priest? I bet you've got a priest in here, a Catholic priest," and they'd say, "No, we haven't." And they've got some secret little hole in some secret little room, behind a cupboard or underneath a bed or something where they hide the priest. It's called the priest hole. But if the government and the people actually caught a priest, they would hang them. And while they were hanging them, they'd cut their guts open so all their fucking intestines and stuff spill out. It's fucking disgusting. And that was sort of seen as a punishment for people for being Catholic. And they thought that Catholics were all traitors. And because of this sort of conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth by some Catholic people, they punished all Catholics. And they said Catholics are cunts and you can't be a Catholic. And Catholic priests are going to be hung and disemboweled and all this shit. So if you were a Catholic in England during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, especially in the second half of it and near the end of it, then you were going to be treated like absolute shit. So it wasn't good for being a Catholic. And this was something that got worse and worse throughout Elizabeth's reign rather than better. She started off saying that she was going to be, chilled out, but then she ended up being a hardcore sort of genocidal maniac. Because of events with assassination attempts and also what happened to the Protestants in France. And during this time, of course, more people are becoming Protestants now, and the Catholics are becoming a minority in England. So, yeah. So who's heir to the throne now? Mary Queen of Scots was the heir to the throne. Now she's dead. So she had a son, and his name was James. And he was now the King of Scotland. He was King James VI of Scotland, and he was the heir to the throne of England to take over after Elizabeth died, because Elizabeth didn't have any kids and wasn't going to have any, and she didn't have any brothers or sisters or whatever. Anyway, so he was the heir. but he wasn't a Catholic like his mother. He was a fucking Protestant, and he didn't give a fuck about Catholics. And because his uncles and people had brought him up, and these people were against his mother, and they told him that his mother was a fucking bitch and Catholics are all a bunch of cunts, and he kind of believed it. And when he grew up and became the king and a man, he didn't give a fuck about Catholics. He didn't give a fuck about his mother. He thought she was probably a stupid old bitch, you know, and he only really cared about himself. Now, Queen Elizabeth I dies at the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, and at the beginning of the 17th century, James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. Now, he's still King of Scotland and King of England separately. He's two kings at the same time, but he's one person, but he's got two kingdoms. Now, this doesn't mean that Scotland and England become one united kingdom joined together, but it does mean that they're both ruled by the same cunt, which is James. So Elizabeth's dead. James is the new boy, new king, and he's a Scottish man. So what do we know about James? Well, James was engaged to marry this Danish princess called Anne. She's known as Anne of Denmark, and when James was King of Scotland, he arranged to marry her, and he went over to Denmark to collect her, pick her up, bring her back to Scotland. And while they were coming back to Scotland, the ship was nearly sunk in a storm. There was this big storm, and it was fucking the ship about, and the ship was going all over the place. And by the grace of God and by good luck, they managed to get home safely, but by the skin of their teeth. And they went, oh fucking hell, that was a bit close, you know. And in Denmark, people really believed in witches and witchcraft, and the Danish people were saying that it was some witches who had that had made the storm happen, and they were trying to kill her and him. And they said that, you know, he said, James, have you heard about these witches? And James said, what? No, what about them? And they said, oh, they're fucking terrible, these witches. They have deals with the devil, and they cause bad things to happen, and you should, you know, you should believe in them. So James starts believing in the existence of witches, and he believes in them quite strongly. And he goes around the country, sort of saying this one's a witch, this one isn't a witch, and so on. And a lot of women get killed for being witches. Although sometimes there's some cunt accusing someone of being a witch, and James comes and says, no, she isn't. But anyway, James writes a book about witches, and how you can see if someone's a witch or if they're not a witch. And James is a man who likes to read and write a lot. He's a big book guy, and he's very intellectual and academic, and he sort of writes about religion, he writes about witches and whatever. And he is referred to by some cunt as being the wisest fool in Christendom, which kind of means that he's intelligent, but he's stupid. And I think what they mean by that is he's good with books and stuff, and he's good at book smarts and academic stuff, but he has no common sense, and he makes bad decisions in life, and he's no good at ruling a country, and he has no sort of intelligence when it comes to people or politics and stuff, but he's very good at reading a book and writing a book, you know. You probably know some cunts that are like that, you know. You might be like that yourself. I think I am. Anyway, so James is into the witches, and William Shakespeare writes a play called Macbeth, and in Macbeth there are these witches, and the play is set in Scotland, and I think Shakespeare wrote it with James in mind, and James really liked Shakespeare. He thought he was fucking brilliant. Well, he is brilliant, so can't blame him. So James had good taste, you know. So anyway, James he's the king of England now, and the English don't know much about him. They're like, who the fuck's this James? You know, some Scottish cunt, you know. And anyway, is he a Catholic? I don't think so. You know, that kind of thing. So James comes down to England, and he sort of goes to London because he thinks that England's kind of a little bit more. Yeah, he's king of both countries, but he decides to go down to London. Anyway, so he's king of England. He's in London. He's got his wife, Anne of Denmark, and they have a few kids together as well. But we'll come back to them. And now Elizabeth had been persecuting the Catholics and stuff, and a group of Catholics, including someone from this Percy family, they get together and they say, we're fucking sick of being persecuted and all this shit that happened under Elizabeth. Maybe when James is king, he's not going to be such a cunt. And they send someone to go and see James and to say, when you become king, can you not be such a cunt to the Catholics, please? You know. And James says, yeah, all right, I'll try not to be as big a cunt, but he really doesn't give a shit, and he really does think the Catholics are a bit of a bunch of cunts, and he doesn't really have any intention of helping them in any way, and he's going to be happy to continue with the laws that punish Catholics and punish Catholic priests and all the rest of it. He's happy to continue all that shit, and he has no intention of fucking changing it. And so the Catholics get sort of pissed off and upset with him because they're still going through the same shit that they were before, and they thought that he would be less of a cunt. Anyway, at this time also there's a parliament in England, and this parliament has developed from the times of Magna Carta gradually and gradually, and now it's not all powerful or anything like that, but it's there, and it's a place where people argue and say things and try to influence the king, and it's not just there to sort of suck his cock, it's there for him to sort of ask questions about and stuff, and they're starting to want to have a bit more power, and for the king not to be so all-powerful himself. And some of these new religious groups also have political ideas about how kings should sort of chill out a bit and let the people have more power. And also there's these new sort of business class and this big middle class that's sort of opening up of people who have made money and they want influence and stuff. But I won't say so much about that at the minute because it's more important in the next video. But King James doesn't much like these parliament people either, and he thinks that he should be fucking king and do whatever the fuck he wants. He believes in something called divine right of kings, which means that the king is put there by God and he can do whatever the fuck he wants, and people have to do what he says. And there's no such thing as a parliament or about people having rights or anything like that. And anyway, a group of these people who are Catholic that don't like the king, they decide that they want to kill him. And the plan that they have is that they'll kill the king and then make his daughter queen. So they're planning to kill the king and his sons and his wife, and also all of the parliament as well, or all of the House of Lords, but it's all of the parliament. Because every time there's a parliament, they meet in the House of Lords, which is one of the two buildings where we have the parliament in England. And all the cunts from the House of Commons have to go to the House of Lords and sit there with all the lords and with the king. And it's like a big meeting, and they get together and they say, right, the king says, right, this is what we're going to fucking do. Now we're going to do this shit and that shit, and this is what's going to happen, you know. And it's like the government sort of getting together and saying what it's going to do. And we still have that today. But the king has to be there, and he has his family with him and everything as well. These dudes, these Catholic dudes, they get together and they get this cunt called Guy Fawkes. And Guy Fawkes is this kind of mercenary who has been fighting with the Spanish against some Protestant guys in the Netherlands or something. And he's a bit of a cunt who's quite good at explosives and shit. And anyway, they get access to the basement underneath the House of Lords, which is where the king is going to be meeting up with all his politicians and the parliament and everything else. So these cunts, they get gunpowder, and they get big barrels full of gunpowder, which you use in guns. It explodes. It's explosive. You set it on fire, it will go boom, blow up. They get all this fucking gunpowder and they stick it underneath the fucking House of Lords. And the plan is that when the House of Lords meets and the king goes there and all the politicians are there and the king and everyone are there, then they'll set fire to it and it will blow up and it will fucking blow all those cunts to Kingdom Come and they'll all be fucking dead. And then they can fucking arrange to kidnap this princess and try to make her a Catholic queen. That's the plan, but one of these cunts has a friend who is a member of parliament, some lord something. Anyway, this cunt is pissed off and worried that his friend's going to get killed when they blow up the place, and he thinks, well, I've got a friend and my friend's in there, and when we blow the thing up, he's going to get killed. And they say, well, that's a sacrifice worth making. And he says, well, I don't agree with you. So he writes a letter to this friend of his, and in the letter he says, be careful, because there's going to be some kind of big explosion or something's going to go bang when you go to Parliament, so don't go that day. That's the 5th of November. Don't go on the 5th of November. Stay at home. And this dude thinks this is a bit weird, sounds a bit strange. So he takes this letter and he goes to the king, and the king looks at the letter and says, there's something weird going on here. And he gets his sort of spy masters and all that, and all his people together. And they search all the premises of the Parliament, of the House of Lords, and they find all the shit in the basement, all the fucking gunpowder and that. And they think, fucking hell, look at all this. Some cunt was going to try to kill us all. And they say, well, let's pretend we haven't seen it, and let's keep quiet about it, and we'll wait till some cunt comes to light the matches. So they have these guards waiting and hiding in the corners, and this Guy Fawkes comes and he's going to light the match and set fire to the gunpowder, and these guards go, aha, and they grab him and they take him and they put him on this device and they torture him, and he's going, fucking hell. And they say, tell us who these other cunts are who's helping you. I want all the fucking names, and he gives them all the fucking names in the end. And then they're all rounded up and executed in horrible ways. They're killed. And James then says, fucking hell, Catholics are a bunch of cunts, and I don't like them. And that's sort of the main thing that King James is famous for. Another thing that he's really famous for is the King James Bible. Now, the King James Bible is a Bible, and it was the first proper modern translation in English of the Bible, and it was for everybody, and King James sort of organized it and said that he was going to be the man whose name was going to be on it. It's called the King James Bible. A lot of people still read the King James Bible, and you can still get the King James Bible in the bookshops. And at this time, the English language was developing into a written language because of the printing press and because of the ability to publish books and pamphlets quite easily. The English language was becoming something that was more something that everybody could read and write. And Shakespeare had influenced it quite a lot, and this Bible really influenced it as well, because it was written in English and people could read it. And it's got a lot of thee and thou and thy and stuff in it. And whenever people quote the Bible now in English, whenever they talk about the Bible or read or remember things that are in it, they always start talking in this fucking 17th century type of speak, saying thy name is, or thou art in heaven, or whatever. And it's the same kind of language as in Shakespeare. It's early modern English. Now, most cunts struggle with it when it's in Shakespeare, but when they find it in the Bible or religious text, they just take it for granted that it's like that. So it's a bit weird, but it's Also, it was another step forward for the Protestants, another kick in the balls for the Catholics, because the Catholics had not wanted to have the Bible translated into other languages. They wanted to keep it in the Latin, but this book was in English. Anyway, King James has a daughter who's married to this count in Bohemia, which is like Czech lands, but they sort of spoke German in those times. And he's the Count of the Palatine. And for a very short time, this count becomes king, and he's a Protestant king in this part of Bohemia, and Prague is where he lives. And he gets defeated and kicked out of his throne by the Catholics, because at this time there's a big war in Europe called the 30 Years' War, where the Catholics are fighting against the Protestants, and this goes on and on. England aren't involved in the 30 Years' War, really. They stay out of it because they're too busy fighting in England. But anyway, James's daughter is called Elizabeth, and she's Elizabeth of Bohemia, and she's over there, and she has a huge family, enormous family, loads of kids, and some of those become important later on. James's eldest son is called Henry, and he dies as a young man before his father, so everyone's upset about that. The second son is called Charles, and when James dies, it's Charles who becomes king, and then things really become interesting. So we'll sort of recap about James. James believed in witches. There was the King James Bible. Also, the Virginia stuff expanded. Jamestown is named after him, and the English continued with the colonization in North America. And James was a bit of a cunt. Now, Elizabeth is sort of seen in England as sort of a great hero and stuff. But that gunpowder plot, when the Catholics tried to kill the king, now we still celebrate that every year in England by having fireworks and bonfires, and that's what that's all about on the 5th of November. So apart from that, really, there's not much to say about James, because he's relatively important, but I think that really the stuff that happens after him is much more important with his son Charles, and that's the next one.